Well, welcome.
We have an exciting talk today, Reverend Ken. Everybody, Reverend Ken is our senior minister. If you don't know him, he is an accomplished theologian, self-proclaimed Bible nerd, geek.
Bible geek, yeah.
And so one of our members, Tony Ortiz, has been asking for years, is always asking some really deep, probing questions about unity beliefs, unity theology. And unfortunately, Tony's not able to be here today, so he sent me some questions. And so maybe we're going to try to stump Reverend Ken. Oh, Reverend Ken, you've shared the times when you went through major trials in your life, and then you found Louise Hay's book, You Can Heal Your Life. How did you get into metaphysics and find unity after that?
Oh, so it's a great question. For those of you who don't know, Louise Hay was a religious science, now called Centers for Spiritual Living, teacher, practitioner, right? And she wrote a book in the 1980s called You Can Heal Your Life. And it was about affirmations and how your thoughts create health and well-being and can shift your life. In the middle of the AIDS crisis, living in New York City, I found and discovered this book. We were all passing it around. And from that group of people who were looking for cures for AIDS when there was no medicine, we found the teachings of New Thought, right? New Thought, for those of you who don't know, it's the idea of we take on new thoughts. So there's a series of religions, which are Christian Science. I first started it, and then Unity became one of them, then religious science, now called Centers for Spiritual Living. And all of those churches, Agape in Los Angeles, Michael Beckwith Church, are all New Thought churches. So that movement in New York City was really profound, and Marianne Williamson was teaching a course in miracles in lecture series at the same time. And so I found myself going to lectures by Marianne Williamson, who started an AIDS support group. And so there was a group of us sitting around with Marianne Williamson talking about the principles in A Course in Miracles and how those merged with New Thought beliefs. And those people told me about unity. And they suggested I go to Avery Fisher Hall. At the time, it's now called Geffen Hall, which is the Philharmonic Hall at Lincoln Center in Manhattan. And I went and saw Eric Butterworth and a packed full church of 3,000 people, all teaching and affirming and proclaiming what we teach here at Unity. And I discovered this movement, which has been around for 150 years, of people who are taking on the New Thought and changing their lives by changing their thoughts. And so that's how I got into it. And, 35 years later, here I am, a Unity minister.
You never know the course that your life is going to be taking, isn't that?
Yeah, if you had told my friends at the time that I was going to become a minister, they would have told you were crazy. But I love that my life experience has been through the valley of the shadow and out through the other side. No, that doesn't mean that my life is perfect and I don't have shadow still to uncover and to bring the light to, but it is 180 degrees different from the life I was living back then.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. And that's informed your ministry and continues to inform the work you're doing here.
Yeah.
So a bit of more of a practical perspective is, do you think collective consciousness can bring peace to our city, state, nation, and how should we view it from a metaphysical standpoint?
Okay, so first I want to define metaphysical, okay? So I love you, Tony, and most people don't understand what we mean by metaphysical. So metaphysical, if we break down the term, means beyond the physical. Right? But we use it in two different ways in Unity. So we say we are a metaphysical theology, meaning that we know that all life happens from thought, from belief, from energy. It isn't just physical. And second part of that is we have metaphysical interpretation of Scripture, all Scripture, Hebrew Scripture, Christian Scripture, the Vedas. All Scripture, all allegory we look at as metaphysically, meaning it's not literal fact, but it tells a more profound and a deeper human story, spiritual story. And so those two terms. So metaphysically, what happens is that everything happens in consciousness. Margaret Mead, right? Margaret Mead was, excuse me, I'm blanking on the term. She was a scientist, a human scientist, right? And she worked in the 20th century. And she said the only thing that has ever created change was a group of individuals. A committed group of individuals is the only thing that actually makes change on the planet, right? And so that is true, that when we come together in community and in thought, that we believe we can make a change, then change happens in the world. You've seen it over the last month. Have you seen how the energy of certain communities have changed in the last month since there was a change in leadership of the Democratic Party? Now, whichever side of the political spectrum you sit on, there has been an adjustment. Everyone has had to adjust to the energy as it changed. And people are engaged in a different way. People are interacting differently because there has been a figure change, but there's been more than that. There's been an energetic change, a generational change. And that speaks to the power of thought, that people perceive it and then they get on board with the idea of this is different. And once that swell of consciousness rises up like a tide, everything shifts. The landscape shifts because the water is higher. The participation shifts because of how many more people are involved. And that's what happens spiritually when we all come together and say, okay, this has to stop. You can look at it back through history. You can look at the rising tide of the abolitionist movement here. Going further back, you can look at the tide of breaking away in the Revolutionary War from England, an understanding that we could govern ourselves, that we didn't need a king. We didn't need a ruler who would tell us what was right and wrong. We could determine that. You can go back even further into history and see all the great movements that have happened in consciousness have happened because that people came together and said, in ancient Greece, we can govern ourselves. In Rome, we can govern ourselves. Now, it doesn't mean it's a direct line. Doesn't mean that we just move forward and we stay there. You know, there is a cycle. And in Ken Wilber's work, there's an idea of to transcend and include, an integral theory, that a new idea comes along and it, like a wave, takes over the old consciousness. But what happens after the wave peaks and crests is that you go back in consciousness and you take back the old ideas and you reincorporate them and you bring them forward again. So you transcend an old idea and then you come back, taking all the history, all the understandings you knew in the past, and you reinterpret them and bring them forward to create a new future. So that process isn't linear, it's cyclical. And that's what we see through the ages. If you can step back far enough, you can see the evolution of consciousness as well as the evolution of physical form on the planet, right?
Wow.
They're parallel. And then it leads us to the evolution of spirituality, too, which Paul Hasselbeck and I debate all the time.
So we'll have him do that sometime, too.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. You know, it just reminds me of the power of individuality and having one thought, and then it brings about other thoughts, and that's how we engage folks, other people together, to then ultimately there's a major change.
Well, think about it in your own life. If you can take on a new thought, like just on a personal level, and this is how I first engaged in unity and in new thought, is like, it's like, I believed that I was destined to be sick, right? That I was flawed, and that I believed that I was vulnerable to disease, right? In the middle of the AIDS crisis. When I can take on a new idea that I am not a human being having a physical limitation, but I'm a spiritual being having a human experience. When I can take on the idea that my birthright is wholeness and health, it shifts everything I experience. It shifts how I interact with medicine. It shifts how I interact with doctors. It shifts how I hear the negative news on the TV. It shifts how I hear the pronouncements of, oh, well, that's just the way it is. You're going to get sick. You're going to do that. Everybody gets sick. Well, no, you don't have to, right? Sickness is a state of mind just like health, and wholeness is a state of mind. And how you approach the whole process of healing and wholeness shifts everything. So once you take on a new thought, take on a new idea, there's nothing that limits you, because everything in you is shifting. Everything is shifting. And so when you go interact then with a friend who's in the midst of it, you just bring the perspective of wholeness to someone who's suffering in the middle of their pain. Doesn't mean their pain isn't real. I'm going to be really clear on that. I'm not saying that people's experience of disease and illness isn't real, but when we can bring a perspective of what's actually happening is your body healing, is your whole soul healing, your whole being healing, then it gives it a different perspective. It goes from despair to this is what's supposed to be happening. And that little shift is the world, is the whole ball game, right?
Wow. I forgot to mention that Reverend Ken did not look at these questions, does not know, so this is him coming off the cuff with this wisdom and insight. So as you're talking about the concept of wholeness and wellness in the face of illness, or diagnosis of illness, this segues into another question that I wanted to point out. Tony asked, there are still Unity members who are uncomfortable with the topic of death. And so if you want to address, how should Unity address what it means to die, to end this physical existence? What's the perspective on looking at that?
It's very, very potent. As many of you may know, my mother passed away in December, and I was there with her at her deathbed, and when she passed, was in the room. And being with someone when they transition from this physical life into whatever is next is one of the most powerful experiences a person can have. And it is one of the greatest privileges of my life and my work, is to be with people at that time. I believe, and Unity teaches, that life is eternal, that we are spiritual beings having this human experience. And for me, and what we teach is that means you existed before this physical body. You didn't start to exist, David, when the sperm hit the egg in your mother's womb, and all of a sudden a being called David existed. In that moment, your eternal being took a physical form. Took a physical form that produced this body, that produced this life experience that you're now having. So what it also means is that when this body, this vehicle you're in right now, no longer serves you, you can release it and go back to the spiritual, purely spiritual form that you once inhabited. And again, that's a shift in perspective. So when we understand that this isn't the end, but a door opening to something else, a door opening to infinite connection and infinite potentiality, we can realize that what we call death is really an awakening to a greater spirit. You know, a lot of our problems, because we've chosen this human experience on some level, are about the floor and making it level, is about the physical building, is about paying the bills, is about getting enough food and shelter and all those physical things to take care of the physical form, right? And to house ourselves and our family and protect ourselves. And that's what wars are made of, that's what battles are, that's what a privilege is discussed, and lack of privilege and lack of access to resources. All those things are products of living in what we believe is a limited physical world, right? And when we can understand that there is something bigger going on and that we don't live in a zero-sum game, that there actually is an infinite supply and sufficiency enough for everyone. We don't have to worry about this body and how long we'll live, but how we live. It's not about how long, but how we live. And then we get to move into, so I'm alive today. I'm alive this very moment. What do I want to do with it? What do I want to do with this day? Do I need to take care of myself in this day? Or is it a day I take care of others? And knowing that balance and that presence, how do I want to spend this moment? And it's about then being present. Present to what is. Present to what could be. When I bring my whole self to the celebration of life. And the celebration of death. Right? Because I grew up in New Orleans. Right? And you can tell by how I say New Orleans, right? I grew up in New Orleans, and we used to celebrate. I remember being a kid standing out on the porch of my grandmother's house and watching the jazz bands walk down the street following a casket, following and dancing with, second lining we call it in New Orleans, celebrating a person's transition. And so that attitude of joy and enthusiasm, celebrating life and death, it is all the same thing. All the same.
It's beautiful. Wow, what an amazing reawakening, reframing of this sometimes terrifying concept, right? Right.
Yeah.
Humanity. So Tony has given me 10 questions that unfortunately we don't have enough time to cover. Maybe we can touch upon it in the online spiritual discussion group after service. But one more question that I think is super important. So. In the past 15 years, this comes from a question that was, I think, on Unity headquarters. The past 15 years, Unity has veered away from its original metaphysical Bible teachings, promoting a wide variety of theological and spiritual beliefs in an effort to attract a new age audience. What are the chances of Unity returning to its metaphysical Christian roots as taught by Charles and Myrtle Fillmore?
Okay, so
That's
Tony,
why I saved this for the last.
I'm going to take issue with a couple of things in the statement. So first off, I don't believe that Unity has veered away from its metaphysical roots. I believe that Charles and Myrtle, and my understanding and my study of it, Charles and Myrtle Fillmore were our co-founders. They started Unity in 1889, and Charles especially was always fascinated with world religions, studied Hinduism, studied Catholicism. He grew up Methodist, and then he studied Native American spirituality. And so all of that was always a part of Unity. And he found the through line of spiritual teachings and spiritual principles in all of the world's religions. And he put it in a package called Unity for a specific purpose, because it was about more than Christianity. Right? It was about spirituality for a long. There's a quote that I used in a Unity magazine article that I wrote 15 years ago, and that was from Charles, who lived in the early 20th century. And it says that I think we will get along a lot faster in our study of spiritual truths if we stop this endless quotation of Scripture. Now, that's Charles Fillmore, our co-founder, saying that we should stop quoting Scripture. But people who want to argue that we've gotten away from our metaphysical roots never mention that quote from Charles. And it just also mentions the other. What's happened for me, so that's some of the setup for this, but what I'm going to talk about is what's happened for me, and I think mirrored in the general population, is there have been a lot of religious toxicity, a lot of spiritual damage done in the name of religion. I grew up Catholic. Being a gay man and Catholic was not permitted. We were told we were miserable sinners. When I was a little kid in New Orleans, There were segregated churches where people of color had to sit in the balcony to attend a Catholic church, right? And the white people got to sit on the floor. There have been lots of harm done to women in the name of religion, to people of color, to gay and lesbian people, and transgender people. So in that mix, this is the world we live in. Religious organizations have not adapted, have not apologized, have not said we were wrong. And what I love about Unity is that it has been willing to do that. It has its own segregated past. It has its own anti-gay past. But we've been able to and are willing to say, you know what? We didn't know what we didn't know. And today, we take ownership. I am proud to be the chair of the board of Unity World Headquarters, where we have apologized for the actions of our past that caused harm to others. I am proud to stand with this organization that says spirituality is evolving and our understanding of the human experience is evolving, and we will not be stuck in the past understanding, but that if we are going to metaphysically interpret Scripture, the interpretation is bound to change because we know more today. So interpretation is always reflected by the interpreter, right? It always is. And so in that moment, we cannot look at what someone 100 years ago thought the Scripture or the teaching meant. We have to look at what we know it means today, in our understanding today of how the brain works, how our neurons work, how race works, that race is just an idea that someone came up with, that in our DNA, there is no difference between you and me or me and Misa. There's so infinitesimally, so little difference between us that the idea that we're different races is absurd. We are the human race. We are all one. And so then our teaching of understanding of oneness explodes in infinite potentiality when we're not tied to what Charles or Myrtle thought 100 years ago, but what we understand and know today. So to even frame the question about what Charles and Myrtle thought 100 years ago is limiting. We have direct access to the divine. We are the interpreters of the moment. And it does not matter what Jesus said, what Charles said. What most important is what you and I can experience of the divine right here and now. And I am excited, and I am a champion for being part of a spiritual movement that understands that this is the moment. There is no future. There is no past. There is only right here and now. And what we know is spiritual truth. Yes, it's influenced by those, our ancestors, those who have come before us. And it is influenced by our own life experience. But what we get to create right here and right now is something that has never existed before. And that is the whole ball game. Unity means that we are one with the one power and the one presence in the world, in our lives, and that all truth, all understanding is available to us right here and now. And then we get to stand on the shoulders of giants. Then we get to be proactive rather than reactive. And that's what we're here to be.